A passenger spat at a colonel in the boarding line. Seconds later, his briefcase became a weapon, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He thought spitting on a child would prove his anger, mocking a boy for being shown respect. Subscribe if you believe no cruelty should go unpunished. The boarding call echoed through the terminal, crisp and indifferent. Priority passengers, you may now begin boarding through Gate A12. The overhead announcement barely cut through the rising tide of voices and rolling suitcase wheels across the polished tiles of Brantford International Airport. The moment those words were spoken, Colonel Adrian Kessler stepped forward from the crowd with silent purpose, his left hand gently resting on the shoulder of his son, Daniel, who walked beside him with wide, searching eyes. They moved with quiet discipline. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, just calm precision born from years of military routine. Kessler's uniform was subdued but unmistakable. Dark slacks, a clean-pressed jacket over a civilian shirt, his bearing unmistakably military. In contrast, Daniel, just shy of 12, clutched his boarding pass in both hands like it might fly away. His sneakers squeaked slightly on the floor, his backpack hanging awkwardly over one shoulder. He had never flown first class before. His face flickered with both pride and the quiet dread of being stared at. They didn't speak, not at first. The colonel preferred to observe silently, scanning the gate, the flight crew at the podium, the passengers clumped near the ropes. He noticed movement in the periphery, a man shifting forward with sharp, annoyed steps. Colonel Kessler didn't need to look directly to register the tension. "What makes them so special?" the man muttered. Malcolm Rhine stood 3 paces behind the colonel and his son. His features were pinched, his jaw tight. The corners of his mouth curled downward like every smile he'd ever attempted had been an effort. A navy blazer hung carelessly on his wiry frame, and his duffel bag sagged against his leg as if he'd been waiting too long for anything and everything in life. His boarding pass was clenched tight between 2 fingers, crumpled at the corners. The colonel didn't react. His hearing was excellent, trained for whispers in far more dangerous places than an airport. He caught the man's tone, coded in bitterness like someone nursing a lifetime of slights that had nothing to do with him or his son. He registered the glare that followed as they stepped beyond the retractable barrier toward the jet bridge entrance. The gate attendant greeted them with a polite nod, unfazed by the quiet storm beginning to gather behind them. Daniel hesitated, glancing back for a split second. That was all it took. Rhine's eyes locked onto the boy's glance and misinterpreted it as mockery. He leaned to one side as if speaking to someone else, but his voice rose just enough to be heard. "Some of us don't get priority just because we put on a uniform or drag a kid around," he grumbled, words soaked in disdain. Daniel flinched. The colonel stopped mid-step and slowly turned his head, not to respond, but to measure. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, calculating, not in anger, but in caution. His instincts prickled. He had seen this kind of man before, one who boiled quietly, letting his insecurities stew until they demanded to lash out. Kessler knew the type well, loud in comfort, cowardly in conflict. "Dad," Daniel whispered, brushing a hand across his cheek and looking up with confused, embarrassed eyes. "It's fine," Kessler said softly, guiding him forward again. "Keep walking." But the tension didn't die. Rhines stayed where he was, jaw tight, knuckles white on his bag strap. His eyes didn't leave them. He gritted his teeth as they neared the boarding gate, feeling that familiar anger, the one that came when the world reminded him others moved forward while he stood still. And now, a soldier and a kid had done just that, right in front of him, unbothered by the hierarchy he believed should apply to everyone equally. He took a single step forward, then another, driven not by purpose but by pride. His muttering grew louder, more targeted. Special treatment for a pair of... He stopped himself, not because of conscience, but because people were now glancing toward him. The colonel heard it. So did Daniel. The boy's lips parted slightly as if to say something, but his father gently shook his head. "Eyes forward," Kessler said, not unkindly. They reached the gate. The agent scanned their passes with professional calm. "Welcome aboard, Colonel," the man said, recognizing the name, the rank, or both. "Thank you," Kessler replied. Just as they moved to step onto the jet bridge, another voice, thick and bitter, sliced through the hallway of noise. "Of course." "First class for the hero and his little prince," Rhines sneered, his sarcasm hanging in the air like smoke. Kessler's steps didn't falter. He didn't look back this time, but his grip on the leather handle of his briefcase tightened, the muscles in his arm twitching slightly beneath his coat. Not because of insult to himself, but because of the sound he'd heard when Daniel's breath caught. The boy didn't understand why someone would speak to them like that, but his father did. The gate attendant raised his eyes toward the man behind the ropes but said nothing. Passengers in the economy line shifted, murmuring. Some watched with raised eyebrows, others rolled their eyes. Malcolm Rhines leaned back against the rope divider, a smirk creeping onto his face like he had just won something. He didn't shout, he didn't lunge, but in his mind he had struck a blow, a small jab at a world that he felt constantly passed him by. The colonel and his son disappeared down the jet bridge, and yet, even as the hush of the terminal resumed, something darker settled in the air behind them. Rhines wasn't finished. He watched the jet bridge entrance like a dog watching a gate that hadn't closed all the way, because sometimes resentment waits for the smallest spark to erupt. The glob of spit struck Daniel's cheek with a sickening splat. For a moment, the terminal went silent. It wasn't the ordinary kind of silence, the kind that hangs in the air before a flight is announced or as people fidget with their phones. This was sharp, stunned silence, the kind that follows a slap in a crowded room. Daniel stood motionless, his body going rigid. His boarding pass slipped slightly in his fingers. The wetness clung to his cheek like a mark of shame, a stain that stung deeper than the skin. His breath caught in his throat. He didn't understand why. He hadn't done anything wrong. Colonel Adrian Kessler's eyes locked onto the man responsible. Malcolm Rhines. The same man who had muttered from the shadows of the waiting area. The same man whose face had twisted with something too ugly to name when Daniel stepped forward beside his father. Colonel Kessler didn't speak. He didn't yell. But the look in his eyes was no longer calm. It was cold steel, dangerous in its restraint. Daniel's small hand reached for his father's coat sleeve, his fingers trembling. His eyes, wide and glistening, didn't look at the man who had spat on him. They searched only for the one person who had never let him down. Colonel Kessler pulled out a clean white handkerchief from his breast pocket and bent down, gently wiping the boy's cheek, his movements careful, almost reverent. He said nothing, but the way his hand lingered just a moment longer on Daniel's shoulder was louder than any promise. The boy's eyes closed briefly. He didn't want to cry, not here, but the burning in his throat and the sting in his eyes betrayed his will. Malcolm scoffed and straightened his jacket. His voice rang out again, louder this time, smug with false victory. "Maybe next time, wait your turn." The words were meant to humiliate, to reduce a proud moment into something cheap and ugly. Around them, murmurs rose. Some passengers gasped. Others turned toward the noise, eyes wide, phones already lifting into recording positions. A few caught the entire sequence on camera. The spit, the silence, the cruel smirk. One man in a tan coat whispered to his wife, "Did he really just spit on a kid?" Another man further back muttered, "Is this real?" Someone stopped that guy. But no one stepped forward. Not yet. The colonel didn't respond to the jeer, not with words, not with accusations. But something shifted in his posture, an almost imperceptible change. His right hand moved from his son's back to the handle of his leather briefcase. It wasn't a sudden motion. It wasn't aggressive. It was deliberate, steady, almost ceremonial. Malcolm wasn't watching closely enough to notice, but Daniel was, and so were the passengers whose cameras were still rolling. A nearby airline agent behind the counter stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to speak or call for help. The gate line moved on without the colonel and his son. People glanced nervously between the man in uniform and the man who had just spat on a child. Daniel finally found his voice, soft and shaking. "Dad. Why did he do that?" Kessler looked down at his son. The boy's innocence shattered with that question, and the father knew that no explanation would make sense to a child who believed the world was mostly kind. He wanted to say it was ignorance, that it was fear, that sometimes people hate what they don't understand. But as his eyes shifted back to Malcolm, who now leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed, proud of his cruelty, those reasons crumbled. There was no misunderstanding here. This was something darker, something intentional. Kessler's jaw tightened. He turned back to the boarding line. But Malcolm wasn't finished. "You think that uniform makes you better than the rest of us?" he sneered, stepping closer. "You flash a badge and suddenly think the rules don't apply?" The colonel said nothing. "You parade around like you're owed something. Your son gets a free pass just because you wear stripes?" Malcolm's voice was louder now, reaching ears across the terminal. Some passengers began filming in earnest, sensing something irreversible was building. A security officer near the far wall raised his radio, speaking quietly but urgently. Daniel's shoulders tensed. He could feel the world closing in. He didn't know what to do. Should he speak? Should he hide? His father had always told him to walk tall, to be calm, to use words first. But this wasn't a moment for words. The colonel's hand tightened around the briefcase. His knuckles went pale. The leather handle creaked softly under his grip. For a moment, he imagined the weight not as papers and military dispatches, but as something more symbolic: justice, honor, a father's promise. He breathed in through his nose. The world was watching. He knew the consequences. A strike would go viral. An action would follow him beyond this terminal. Headlines would spin, critics would judge, and politics would devour the truth. But then he looked down at his son. Daniel, still wiping his cheek, still standing silently, still wondering why being proud of his father had earned him this humiliation. That was the moment. Colonel Kessler turned toward Malcolm again, his jaw set, his stance square. The briefcase didn't rise yet, but its grip told a story. The colonel knew this wasn't just about getting on the plane anymore. It was about what kind of world his son would walk into, and whether anyone would stand up when dignity was spat on. His eyes burned, not with rage, but with purpose. Passengers held their breath. Some leaned forward slightly. The man with the tan coat began to speak again, but the words didn't come. One of the gate attendants tapped something urgently into his tablet, looking toward the approaching security officers. But the moment hadn't exploded yet. It was still hanging, fragile, electric. The colonel never raised his voice. He didn't push. He didn't lash out. But Daniel saw something shift in his father's face, like a storm behind calm eyes. The kind of storm that waited, quietly, until the exact right moment. And Malcolm? He didn't even see it coming. Not yet, because all he saw was a man holding a briefcase. And all Daniel saw was a father preparing to do what fathers must do when silence no longer protects the innocent. When a father's honor is tested, silence becomes impossible. The moment snapped like a rubber band stretched too far. With the crowd murmuring and Daniel clinging tightly to his father's sleeve, Colonel Adrian Kessler stood rooted, his spine straight, his grip tightening around the handle of his leather briefcase. Across from him, Malcolm Rhines wore a smirk that stretched too wide, a look not of embarrassment or regret, but triumph, the kind of cruel satisfaction that only comes from harming someone weaker and thinking you'll get away with it. Kessler's mind raced, not with confusion, but with calculation. He had trained for moments of crisis, but this was different. This wasn't war. This wasn't the field. This was personal. A stranger had spat on his 12-year-old son, not shouted at him, not brushed past him. Spat. And now, in front of dozens of stunned passengers, Malcolm looked proud of it. Daniel tugged on his arm again, whispering with a voice too broken for his age. "Dad, why did he do that?" Kessler didn't respond. His throat felt like iron, and his silence was louder than anything he could say. The boy's face was still damp where the spit had landed, his eyes red and wide, his hands shaking at his sides. Around them, a ripple of voices began to rise, passengers shocked, some furious, others too stunned to speak. A few had already lifted their phones, cameras catching every frame, but Malcolm didn't care. His smirk remained. "Maybe next time, wait your turn," Malcolm sneered again, louder now, turning slightly so the surrounding passengers could hear. His eyes dared the colonel to act, his voice dripping with mockery. That was the moment. Without warning, Colonel Kessler shifted his weight, his feet firm on the smooth tile floor. With a precise motion, no hesitation, no flair, he raised the leather briefcase high and swung it forward. The weight of the case, lined with hardened corners and filled with tightly packed files, connected squarely with Malcolm's chest. The sound echoed, a dull, meaty thud that cut through the chatter like a blade. Malcolm gasped, stumbling backward 3 full steps, his hands instinctively clutching at his sternum. His expression twisted instantly, from smugness to confusion, then to pain. The crowd recoiled, a collective intake of breath surging through the terminal like wind through a tunnel. Colonel Kessler did not advance. He did not raise the briefcase again. He didn't even flinch. He simply stood his ground, both feet planted, one hand still gripping the case, the other gently resting near his son's shoulder. His eyes, cold and unblinking, stayed fixed on Malcolm, like a hawk that had already struck and knew it didn't need to do so again. Malcolm staggered upright, chest heaving, his voice cracking. "Assault! You all saw it. He hit me." His cry rang out, shrill and desperate, but no wave of support followed it. The passengers remained where they stood, silent, watching. A few moved closer to Daniel, shielding him subtly. Others recorded everything without comment, the glow of their phone screens flickering in the overhead lights. One man, standing with his arms crossed near the gate ropes, muttered under his breath, "He had it coming." Malcolm turned, eyes scanning the crowd for anyone to back him up. But no one moved. No one echoed his cry. The mood had shifted, and he felt it. The tide of sympathy was not with the man who spat on a child, but with the soldier who had remained calm until he couldn't any more. Kessler finally spoke, but his voice was barely above a whisper. "That's enough." The words weren't loud, but they struck harder than the briefcase. Malcolm froze, one foot half raised as if about to retreat. The authority in Kessler's voice wasn't born of anger, it was something colder, something unshakable, a command stripped of emotion, not rage, but resolve. Daniel, still standing close, stared up at his father with a complex mix of awe and fear. He had never seen this side of him, not in drills, not in photographs, not in the quiet bedtime stories about service and duty. This was different. This was the moment the stories were forged from. The gate agents stepped forward at last, 2 men in navy vests marked with security badges. One held his hands out gently. "Sir, we need everyone to remain calm," he said, his eyes darting from the colonel to Malcolm. "Please, let's de-escalate." Malcolm barked a bitter laugh, still clutching his chest. "You call that calm? He just hit me. That's assault. Arrest him." The agents hesitated. Their eyes flicked to the phones held up by witnesses. They had seen enough viral disasters to know this wasn't a simple case of passenger disturbance. There was a narrative unfolding here, one the internet was already shaping. "I'll need to ask both of you to stay until we sort this out," the taller agent said carefully, his tone neutral but edged with urgency. Colonel Kessler gave a curt nod. "Of course. But my son stays by my side." "You'll be treated with fairness, sir," the agent replied, though his eyes betrayed uncertainty. Daniel's fingers tightened around his father's jacket. Kessler didn't need to look down to feel the tremble in his son's hand. He shifted slightly, placing his body between Daniel and Malcolm, an instinct older than training. Malcolm, seeing the lack of support, tried again. "You all saw it," he shouted, pointing a shaky finger. "You saw what he did." But no one responded. No one rushed to his defense. In that silence, Malcolm's power evaporated. The briefcase now hung at the colonel's side again, still and heavy. It hadn't been raised in rage. It had been a line drawn in motion, a father's silent answer to a public act of hate. And as the murmurs resumed, as the security agents reached for their radios and whispered requests for backup, the air in the terminal thickened with a new awareness. Everyone there, whether they admitted it or not, understood something fundamental had shifted. The man who had spat had found his match, not in violence, but in purpose. Sometimes, the colonel thought as his hand settled once more on Daniel's shoulder, a single strike changes the balance of power. The sound of the spit hitting Daniel's cheek echoed louder than any shout. The air thickened. Colonel Kessler took one sharp step forward, his eyes burning, but he held himself back. Daniel froze beside him, one hand still clutching his father's sleeve, the other rising slowly, as if unsure whether to wipe his own face or shield himself. Murmurs rolled through the crowd like a rising tide. Then someone shouted, "He spat on the kid!" Heads turned. A man in a gray windbreaker stepped forward, eyes wide with disbelief. "That man spat on that boy. I saw it with my own eyes." Another voice joined. "We all saw it. Check the cameras." The tension snapped like a taut wire. From behind the boarding counter, 2 security personnel rushed into the area. Uniformed in navy with orange trim, they moved quickly and with practiced calm. One, a tall man with a buzz cut and clipboard under his arm, stepped between the colonel and Malcolm. The other stood to Malcolm's left, ready to intervene if needed. Neither Kessler nor Malcolm moved, but the air between them sizzled with unspoken threat. "Gentlemen," said the guard with the clipboard, "step back and keep your hands visible. We're going to need to ask a few questions." Colonel Kessler raised his hands briefly, slow, steady, controlled. Daniel, still at his side, had tears streaking down his face, but his chin had begun to lift, even just a little. He clung to his father's sleeve like it was the only solid thing in the world. Malcolm, however, scoffed loudly. "I was attacked. That man just assaulted me with his briefcase out of nowhere." His voice was shaky now, his eyes darting to the recording passengers. "I didn't touch the kid. He just went wild." "You spat on my son," the colonel said at last, his voice low but ironclad. "That's not an accident." "I didn't," Malcolm started, but his words were cut off by a third voice. "He did." A young man in a college sweatshirt, no older than 25, stepped forward and held up his phone. "I recorded the whole thing. You can hear him clear as day." He handed the phone to the security officer, who took it carefully, nodding. "I'll need to review this," the guard said, stepping back toward a small podium beside the boarding lane. He tapped the screen and turned up the volume. The gathered crowd went silent, listening. From the phone came Malcolm's voice, unmistakable and sharp. "What makes you so special?" Then the sound of spitting. Then a louder voice, his voice again. "Maybe next time. Wait your turn." Malcolm's face drained of color. His eyes flicked from the phone to the colonel, then to the passengers, then back to the phone. "It was a cough," he blurted out. "I just coughed, it wasn't—" "That wasn't a cough," said another passenger, stepping forward. "That was hate." Malcolm's hands clenched. "He still hit me with his briefcase. That's assault, and you all saw it." The colonel didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence had become louder than any argument Malcolm could make. His eyes remained fixed, not on Malcolm, but on Daniel. He knelt beside his son, pulling a clean cloth from his inside pocket and gently wiping the boy's cheek. "You all right?" he asked softly. Daniel gave a small nod, his lip trembling. "Why would someone do that?" he asked. The colonel swallowed hard. His throat was dry, and the question was heavier than any uniform he had ever worn. "Because some people forget what it means to be decent," he said gently. "But we don't." By now, the buzz of passenger voices had grown into a chorus of frustration, disbelief, and anger. A few passengers began arguing directly with Malcolm, while others demanded the airline take immediate action. But the guards held their ground, trying to contain the scene. "We've called for a supervisor," said the buzz-cut officer to the colonel. "He'll be here in just a moment. In the meantime, please remain where you are." More passengers chimed in, offering to share their footage, detailing what they saw. One man in a business suit leaned toward the guard and whispered, "There's going to be a lawsuit if the airline tries to sweep this under the rug." That kid didn't deserve that. Nobody does. Malcolm looked cornered now, but still he tried to salvage control. "I'm not the villain here," he hissed, his voice rising in desperation. "This is reverse discrimination. He used force. That's the real crime." Another passenger laughed, a bitter, incredulous sound. The crime was thinking you could get away with it. Suddenly, the second guard, who had been monitoring the footage on a separate device, turned to his partner. "It's clear," he said. "He spat." It wasn't a cough. The tone, the expression, it's all deliberate. Malcolm's jaw tensed. His eyes flashed, not with confidence now, but panic. "You're all just trying to frame me because he's in uniform." The colonel stood then, slow and calm, and for the first time, stepped fully into the space between his son and Malcolm. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a single aggressive motion, but the air shifted. "I've served in silence for 20 years, he said quietly, "but I won't let my son be dishonored in public while I stand and do nothing. You spit not just on a child, but on decency itself." The security guards exchanged looks, no longer unsure. They nodded slowly. The tension began to tilt, the weight of witness, footage, and truth pressing down on Malcolm's fragile defenses. Still, the colonel didn't claim victory. He returned his focus to Daniel, adjusting the boy's collar gently, like restoring a crease to a uniform. His voice softened. "We're all right," he whispered. "We don't let moments like this define us." From the corner, the college student stepped forward again, phone still in hand. "If you need this for a report or whatever," he said to the guards, "you've got my permission to use it." The main guard took it gratefully. "We appreciate it." Malcolm stood in silence now, sweating, pale and visibly shaken. His earlier swagger had dissolved. One of the guards motioned for him to stay where he was. The other turned back toward the colonel, nodding with professional respect. The supervisor hadn't even arrived yet, but the direction of the storm was clear. Justice was no longer a question of who spoke loudest. It was a matter of what the world had already seen. And as the phone replayed Malcolm's voice once more, "Maybe next time. Wait your turn," there was no doubt left. The colonel stepped back, steady and silent, his grip on Daniel's shoulder like the anchor of a ship weathering a storm. He said nothing more because everything necessary had already been said. When truth is recorded, lies begin to tremble. Malcolm clutched his chest dramatically, stumbling a step backward as if the weight of justice itself had landed too hard upon him. I'm hurt," he gasped, his voice uneven and theatrical, glancing around as though fishing for sympathy. A few passengers raised skeptical eyebrows. Others scoffed outright. But amid the murmuring crowd, the shift in energy was undeniable. What had started as unified outrage was now showing cracks of hesitation. The airline supervisor, a tall, balding man with a badge that read G. Harlan, pushed through the knot of people forming near the boarding gate, his face tight with tension. "What exactly is going on here?" Harlan asked sharply, though his voice carried a nervous edge. He glanced between Colonel Kessler, stern and unflinching in his military stance, and Malcolm, who was wheezing like a wounded actor in a school play. Behind the colonel stood Daniel, still pale, but clinging with quiet strength to his father's sleeve. "I'd like both of you to step aside, please." "We'll handle this in private," the supervisor continued, already gesturing toward a nearby service corridor. Colonel Kessler didn't move. His eyes, dark and resolute, never left Harlan's face. "My son stays with me," he said, voice low but unwavering. Each syllable dropped like a command. There was no room for negotiation. Harlan blinked, clearly rattled by the colonel's authority. Malcolm, still breathing heavily, pointed a trembling finger toward him. "You saw it. He attacked me. That was unprovoked. Look at my chest." He pressed against his shirt, as if expecting it to reveal bruises that hadn't yet appeared. "All I did was speak, and he just swung at me like some war-hardened brute." "Stop lying," a voice from the crowd snapped. A young man in a hoodie stepped forward, holding up his phone. "I got it all on video. You spat on a kid. Everyone here saw it." Another passenger raised his own device. "Same here." "You provoked him," the chorus began. "I saw it too." "You mocked the boy." "Check the cameras." Harlan's face paled. The crowd wasn't just angry now, they were mobilizing. The moment was slipping from his control, and he knew it. Still, the supervisor tried to regain footing. "Let's not escalate this further," he said cautiously. "We need to stay neutral and follow proper procedures. Sir," he added, addressing Kessler with a strained attempt at diplomacy, "even in difficult moments, we must maintain order." Kessler said nothing. He looked down at Daniel, who gazed back with wide eyes. The boy had stopped trembling, but the sting of humiliation still clung to him like smoke. The colonel placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder. In that silent moment, Daniel straightened, shoulders squaring just slightly under the weight of his father's quiet strength. "Favoritism," Malcolm muttered again, louder this time, his voice carrying a venomous hiss. "Just because he's in uniform, he gets to do whatever he wants." "I get it. One rule for the rest of us." Someone laughed, sharp and cutting. "You spat on a child, man." "Sit down." The laughter grew. Malcolm's eyes darted around the room, and for a moment his act faltered. The hand on his chest dropped. But then, sensing the moment turning again, he doubled down. He leaned against the wall, let out a weak cough, and winced dramatically. "My ribs. They feel cracked. That bag hit me hard. I might need medical attention." He looked toward Harlan expectantly, clearly hoping for some kind of official reaction. Harlan hesitated, caught in the crossfire of pressure. If the colonel's briefcase swing was now being framed as an assault, the airline could be liable. The fear in his eyes wasn't just of the angry crowd, it was of corporate fallout. He glanced at the uniform on Kessler, then at the recording phones, then at Malcolm's theatrical performance. "Sir, I'm going to need you to—" Harlan began again, but he never finished. From the back of the crowd, a man stepped forward, a clean-shaven passenger in business attire holding up his phone. "I have the clearest angle. You can see everything." Malcolm spit at the kid, mocked him, then played victim after getting what he deserved. "Me too," said another. "You want the truth? It's right here. Use it." The air thickened. Malcolm's eyes widened as more and more phones were raised like silent witnesses. The crowd had chosen their side, and it wasn't his. Yet still the tension wasn't fully broken. Harlan turned to Kessler, lowering his voice. "Colonel, I need you to understand. This could get complicated. If he claims injury and presses charges, even with video evidence, the story could shift. Media, lawyers, it gets messy fast." Kessler's gaze remained level. "I understand." He turned slightly, letting his voice rise, not in anger, but with unwavering clarity. "Every passenger here has seen what happened. My son," he said, gently guiding Daniel forward, "was assaulted and humiliated. And now, the man who did it is pretending to be the victim. I won't let that stand. I won't let him be the one who decides how this ends." Daniel looked up again, the humiliation in his eyes replaced by something sharper. pride. Resolve. Behind the father and son, the sea of the passengers stood still, phones ready, loyalty unspoken but unmistakable. Malcolm, realizing the tide was turning too fast to swim against, coughed again, but this time it landed flat. No sympathy, no attention. Just silence. Harlan stepped back, finally understanding the gravity of the moment. He wasn't dealing with just a passenger dispute anymore. This was a powder keg of justice, optics, and public opinion waiting to ignite. The colonel exhaled slowly, tightening his hand on Daniel's shoulder. The noise from the terminal seemed distant now, muffled under the weight of what came next. He didn't need to yell. His words, simple and sharp, cut through the noise. When the battle shifts to words, truth must march louder than lies. The door to the security room clicked shut behind them, muffling the rising noise from the terminal. The air inside was cooler, sterile, laced with the faint hum of overhead lights and the scent of industrial cleaning fluid. Colonel Adrian Kessler walked in behind his son, his steps deliberate, his hand firm but gentle on Daniel's shoulder. The boy's eyes were still red, though he held back tears now with the same quiet resolve he had inherited from his father. Malcolm Rhines had entered first, dragging his feet theatrically, one hand gripping his chest like he was recovering from a battlefield wound. He made sure his muttered accusations, brutality, assault, military aggression, were loud enough for the two uniformed officers waiting inside to hear. One of the officers, a tall man with a shaved head and clipboard, exchanged a glance with his partner, a stocky man who leaned against the far wall with folded arms. Both watched the scene unfold with practiced neutrality, but their raised brows hinted at skepticism. "Take a seat," the taller officer said, motioning to two separate chairs placed deliberately far apart. "We'll speak with each of you individually." Malcolm flopped into his chair with an exaggerated groan, clutching his ribs. "You'd think a man with medals would know better than to attack an unarmed civilian." The colonel ignored him completely, guiding Daniel gently to a bench just outside the inner office. "Stay here." "I'll be right inside," he said quietly. Daniel nodded but gripped his father's hand for an extra second before letting go. Inside the room, Kessler stood tall, his frame unmoving, even as one officer began recording the session and the other opened a digital file on a sleek laptop. "Name and occupation?" the taller one asked. "Colonel Adrian Kessler. United States Army. On approved military leave." The stockier officer leaned forward. "Can you walk us through the incident at the gate?" Kessler's voice was calm, even. "I was in the priority boarding line with my 12-year-old son." A man, Malcolm Rhines, began shouting at us. Then he spat on my son. When I wiped my son's face, the man continued to taunt us. I struck him once with my briefcase. "Did he threaten you or your son physically before the strike?" "No direct threat," the colonel said, his jaw tightening. "But spitting on a child is an act of aggression." His intent was clear. I made one calculated response. I did not escalate. The room was silent for a moment as the officers processed his words. In the hallway, muffled sounds filtered in, the terminal still buzzing with passengers, likely still discussing what they'd witnessed. "Anything else you want to add?" the stocky officer asked. Kessler folded his arms. "Review the footage." Meanwhile, Malcolm's interview was unfolding in a mirror-opposite tone. He gestured wildly, wheezed theatrically, and clutched at his ribs like a silent film actor. "He didn't even warn me." Just bam! Out of nowhere. Guy snapped. I was just standing there. I coughed, and he thought I spit. "You coughed and happened to hit a 12-year-old boy's face?" the officer asked with a raised brow. "I wasn't even aiming at him." "It was crowded, people cough." "But you also said something to him, didn't you?" the other officer asked. Malcolm paused, his eyes flickering. "Maybe something about waiting your turn." "You know, discipline. These military guys are supposed to respect the rules, not break them." Out in the hallway, Daniel sat quietly, legs swinging slightly off the bench, his face still streaked with the remnants of tears. A security guard stood nearby, keeping a watchful but relaxed posture. Daniel glanced toward the door where his father had gone in, then turned toward the hallway windows. He could just make out the figures of angry passengers still clustered at the counter, some filming, some speaking into their phones. Then came a new voice, sharp and oily. "Where's my brother?" A man in a tailored gray suit swept into the area, his briefcase swinging and Bluetooth earpiece blinking red. He moved with corporate confidence, flashing a business card before anyone asked. Victor Rhines. Legal representation. My client is being harassed by this airport and a military officer who overstepped his authority. He barged toward the officers mid-questioning. This stops now. I want all proceedings paused until my client's rights are fully protected. The taller officer stepped into the hallway. Sir, we're handling this by the book. Then change the book, Victor snapped, because if this goes public, your airline will be held responsible for allowing a soldier to attack an unarmed man. From the bench, Daniel shrank slightly, his eyes darting toward the door as though checking that his father was still close. One of the officers noticed and leaned down beside him. You all right, buddy? Daniel nodded but whispered, They'll believe him, won't they? At that moment, the door opened and Colonel Kessler stepped back into the hallway. He knelt before his son, placing a hand on his shoulder, his eyes calm but unblinking. They will believe what cannot be denied. Gasps filled the security room as the footage played on the monitor, Malcolm's face twisted with malice, the sound unmistakable. Maybe next time. Wait your turn. The spit landed squarely across Daniel's cheek, freezing the boy mid-step. It was not an accident. The audio betrayed the truth. No cough, no misstep, just a deliberate act laced with contempt. Colonel Adrian Kessler stood still, arms at his sides, his uniform straight and undisturbed, but his eyes never left the screen. The room was quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't soothe, it stings. One officer reached out to pause the footage, but the colonel spoke calmly. Let it play again. His voice was low, but carried authority. Reluctantly, the officer restarted the clip. The sequence repeated. Spit, smirk, jeer, gasps again. Malcolm shifted in his chair, his earlier arrogance replaced by visible unease. It wasn't like that, he insisted, a forced chuckle escaping his lips. You can't see clearly. Maybe the angle makes it look worse than... No, came the soft reply from the younger officer, his eyes narrowed at the screen. It's perfectly clear. Outside the security room, chaos brewed. The boarding gate had become a boiling pot of tension. Passengers crowded near the counter demanding updates. A few argued with airline staff. One man pointed toward the terminal windows. If they let that guy walk free after spitting on a kid, I'm canceling my ticket. I'll post it everywhere. Another added, we all saw what happened. That officer didn't start anything. He protected his son. The murmurs grew into a storm. The airline staff, previously composed behind their sleek uniforms and scripted responses, now looked shaken. A manager in a navy vest whispered into his earpiece, his hands trembling. The response from higher-ups wasn't fast enough. Not in this world where a single video could become a movement before someone in corporate even noticed the spark. Inside the room, Malcolm's desperation mounted. He leaned forward, coughing dramatically. I mean, you don't know how hard he hit me. That briefcase, it could have broken a rib. I'm still having chest pain. One of the guards looked over. You didn't mention that earlier. I was in shock, Malcolm answered quickly, then leaned back, cradling his chest with exaggerated care. Honestly, I think I need medical attention. The door flew open. A tall man in a charcoal gray suit stepped inside, his entrance commanding immediate attention. His black attaché case clicked shut as he approached the table without acknowledging the officers. Victor Rhines, he announced crisply. "Legal counsel to my brother Malcolm." "And this," he said, tapping a folded sheaf of documents onto the table, "is a formal notice of intent to pursue legal action against Colonel Kessler for assault, emotional trauma, and endangerment." The colonel didn't flinch. He turned slightly toward Victor, offering nothing more than a calm stare. Victor's eyes flickered, expecting a reaction, but receiving none. Instead, the colonel's stillness became its own challenge. "You're just going to stand there?" Victor pressed, irritation creeping into his voice. "You struck a civilian. It's all on tape. My brother's rights have been violated." An officer glanced at the footage on the screen, still paused at the exact frame showing Daniel's horrified expression and Malcolm's sneering face. "We've reviewed the tape. It shows your client instigated a direct assault on a minor. Victor didn't blink. And the response was violence from a trained officer. That will not go unnoticed in court." Colonel Kessler's voice cut through the room like the edge of a blade. "Your brother spat on my son." Victor smiled, but it was hollow. "And your reaction put a civilian in harm's way. You think the public will side with force?" The colonel remained silent, but the silence was not surrender. It was calculation, discipline, measured strength. Another officer, who had been monitoring his phone, suddenly lifted it high. "We've got another video." From a different angle, everyone turned. The second footage played. This time, there was no room for doubt. Malcolm's face was in perfect frame. His smirk, his lean forward, the act itself. The remark, clear and sharp. "Maybe next time, wait your turn." Then the briefcase strike, controlled and precise, not out of rage but defense. Outside the room, passengers had begun live-streaming their own recordings. The hashtags were already gaining traction. Hashtag Justice for Daniel. Colonel did right. Hashtag Spit of Disgrace. Inside, Victor's confidence faltered. He looked at Malcolm, whose face had lost its color. The arrogance that had once buoyed him now sank beneath the weight of evidence. The officers exchanged glances. One of them nodded grimly. "We'll be forwarding this footage to the district office." Malcolm shot to his feet. "You can't do this. I was provoked. They'll believe me." Victor put a hand on his brother's shoulder, trying to calm him. But even he could see that the tide had shifted, and not in their favor. Colonel Kessler finally spoke again, this time looking straight at Victor. "This is no longer about influence or intimidation. It's about decency." Victor, lips pressed tightly together, gave no reply. The weight of the moment had outgrown legal threats. It had become something neither of them could control, a movement already echoing beyond the walls of the room. The officer at the door looked toward his team. "Get in touch with the airline's legal affairs." This just became a lot bigger, and as Victor Rhines gathered his documents with a slow, forced calm, the colonel gently moved to stand beside his son once more, who had watched through the glass the entire time. The room fell silent again, the kind of silence that came not from confusion, but from clarity. When justice meets strategy, the war begins on paper. In the boarding line, a passenger spat on a colonel's son, raging at their first-class treatment and hurling abuse without shame. If you believe every act of hate must be answered, hit subscribe now. Justice starts here. Victor's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You're making a mistake," he barked at the officers, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the tiled floor as he stepped forward. "My brother was assaulted. He's the victim here. If you don't release him immediately, you'll be hearing from my firm before sunset." His eyes burned with rehearsed fury, the kind honed in courtrooms and boardrooms, not born of truth, but manufactured from pressure. Malcolm, standing behind him, straightened with a smirk, his earlier fear smothered by the weight of his brother's confidence. He even gave a smug glance toward Colonel Kessler, as if daring him to challenge their rising influence. But the colonel didn't flinch. He stood with quiet control, one hand resting lightly on Daniel's shoulder. The boy had grown silent again, shifting in his chair as if the pressure of the room threatened to close in on him. His small fingers nervously tapped against the wood of the table, his gaze bouncing between the arguing adults and the screens still glowing in front of the officers. The officers, both visibly conflicted, exchanged a glance. They weren't used to scenes like this, where two sharply dressed men each commanded a different kind of authority. One wore his stripes on his chest, the other wore them in legal threats and practiced outrage. For a moment, it seemed the room might tilt in Victor's favor, the way it often did when money and lawyers walked in uninvited. But then, the colonel's voice rose, low, deliberate, impossible to ignore. "This isn't about me," he said, his eyes fixed squarely on Victor. "This is about a man who spat on a child." The room stilled. The sentence, spoken without anger, dropped into the center of the space like a stone into still water. It rippled outward, unsettling the performance Victor had begun. The officers straightened. One of them cleared his throat as if resetting his position, physically and mentally. Daniel looked up at his father, and something shifted in the boy's posture. He sat straighter, as if the words had lifted the weight from his shoulders. His father hadn't raised his voice, hadn't threatened or begged. He had named the truth and placed it squarely on the table where no one could look away. But Victor wasn't done. He stepped forward again, trying to shift the angle of attack. "And what are we supposed to believe? That a decorated officer can't control his temper? That he doesn't know how to restrain himself with civilians? If this is handled poorly, the headlines won't say, 'Father protects son.' They'll say, 'Military man strikes unarmed citizen.' Are you ready for that headline? Are you willing to take that risk?" There was a pause. It worked, briefly. The younger officer's eyes darted to the colonel, searching for signs of regret, uncertainty, anything that might hint at guilt. The balance of power trembled on the edge. Then the buzz of a phone shattered the moment. One of the airline staff, who had remained quiet until now, turned his screen around to the officers. "Sir, there's another video," he said. Everyone turned. The footage played with eerie clarity. From a different angle, slightly behind and to the side, it captured the moment in full. Malcolm's face was unmistakable. The way he leaned forward, the slow curl of his lips into a sneer, the precise motion of his mouth. The spit arced clearly through the air and hit Daniel's cheek with brutal accuracy. There was no stumble, no cough, no doubt. And then came the smile. Malcolm's expression afterward, smug, proud, almost amused, sealed his fate. Victor's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. He turned to his brother in disbelief. "You said it wasn't clear," he muttered. Malcolm's face lost all color. His smirk evaporated, replaced by blank stare as the video replayed on loop, the mocking smile caught in digital memory forever. Phones began to buzz again. Alerts from social media platforms pinged into the room, one after another. The second video had made its way online. Comments, retweets, headlines. It was already trending. Colonel Kessler's son assaulted at Gate 12. Passenger spits on child, blames father. Justice at Brantford International. The officers didn't need to say anything. The video, the public, the moment, everything was already moving faster than their reports could catch up. Outside the room, passengers huddled around phones, watching the clip in real time. Airline staff struggled to keep order. Voices rose, some of them chanting in support of the colonel. Others filmed their own reactions, narrating the injustice as if they had become part of a documentary. Inside, the walls seemed to pulse with the weight of what had just unfolded. Malcolm's legs shifted as if preparing to run, but there was nowhere to go. His brother grabbed his arm, whispering harshly, "Don't say a word." Colonel Kessler didn't gloat. He didn't smile or thank anyone. He simply looked down at his son, who now sat taller, more certain. The man who had started this confrontation with cruelty was now exposed under the spotlight of public judgment. And it wasn't over, because Malcolm wasn't just facing the colonel anymore, he was facing everyone, and he knew it. When pride leaks into the world, no walls can hold it back. The officer's voice sliced through the tension like a blade. We've reviewed 3 separate recordings. They all confirm the same sequence of events. The room fell silent. Even the low hum of the airport's ventilation system seemed to hush in the weight of that declaration. Malcolm Rhines, who just moments ago had been pacing with mock indignation, stopped mid-step. His mouth opened slightly as if to argue, but no words came. His eyes flicked from one uniformed officer to another, searching for a lifeline that didn't exist. Colonel Adrian Kessler remained where he stood, still and unshaken. His military posture was natural, shoulders squared, eyes steady. He had faced chaos before, in deserts and war zones, but this was different. This was personal. He shifted slightly only to check on his son. Daniel, still seated off to the side, straightened in his chair. His young hands, which had been clenched tightly around the armrest, now released slowly. There was something new in his gaze. Not relief, not yet, but something close. Pride. The kind that grows when you see someone protect you not with noise, but with truth. Victor Rhines, sharply dressed and dripping with corporate confidence, snapped forward. His voice was sharp and full of false righteousness. "This is ridiculous. You're taking the word of shaky cell phone videos over the testimony of my client?" He was struck. "That's excessive force. That's assault." The lead officer didn't flinch. He held up a tablet, the frame frozen on a grainy image, Malcolm's sneering face inches from the boy, spit midair. "The video speaks for itself," he said evenly. Victor advanced a step, pointing with dramatic flair. "The colonel is using his rank to intimidate. You don't know the pressure a decorated officer can exert over civilians. That child was used to justify violence." Colonel Kessler turned his head slightly, his voice controlled and deliberate. "I will not allow my son to be abused without consequence." He didn't raise his voice, didn't move a muscle beyond what was necessary. And yet the statement landed with the weight of a courtroom verdict. Even Victor paused. Even Malcolm, for all his bluster, visibly recoiled. The silence that followed was thick, tense with unspoken calculations and fragile egos cracking under the pressure of truth. The officers conferred quietly by the corner of the room. After a minute that felt like an hour, one of them turned to address the group. "We're detaining both parties for formal questioning. Standard procedure given the physical contact. You'll both be escorted to the terminal precinct." The words struck like ice water. The colonel's brow twitched for the first time. "You're detaining me?" he asked, calm but incredulous. Not furious, just surprised at the reflexive neutrality of protocol. "Yes, sir," the officer said with slight unease. "This is not a judgment of guilt." "It's just the next step." Daniel stood up quickly, worry returning to his eyes. "Are they arresting you?" he whispered, moving to his father's side. "No," the colonel said, resting a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "Just a process, son. We'll be fine." As they began walking out, escorted by 2 airport police, the doors to the holding room opened. The corridor beyond buzzed with sound and then erupted. Cheers, applause. Dozens of passengers had gathered outside, their faces full of fury and admiration. Phone cameras pointed at Malcolm, but the lens of their respect was aimed squarely at the colonel and his son. "Shame on him," someone shouted. "You did the right thing, Colonel," another voice rang out. Daniel blinked, startled by the noise. His hand tightened around his father's sleeve, but not from fear. Something else now. Belief. The kind of belief that blooms when strangers stand beside you. Malcolm shrank under the chorus of voices, his chest puffing in reflexive arrogance but his steps faltering. His face was pale and tight, the smile gone, replaced by something that looked a lot like panic. Victor tried to raise his voice again, calling out about lawsuits and injustices, but even his words fell flat in the storm of public scorn. The colonel did not acknowledge the crowd. He didn't need to. His calm stride said enough. And as they walked through the hallway with his son beside him and applause echoing behind them, Daniel whispered under his breath. Not to anyone, not for show, but just loud enough for his father to hear, "Thank you for standing up for me." The colonel only nodded once, and then came the line that wrapped the moment in steel. "When justice is demanded by many, even power struggles to resist." The metal door shut behind Colonel Adrian Kessler with a muted clang, its echo swallowed by the thick silence of the precinct's interrogation room. The fluorescent light above flickered once before, holding steady, casting a sterile glow over the polished steel table and the two empty chairs. Kessler stood tall, his uniform immaculate, his eyes calm but razor-sharp. To any observer, he looked like a man stepping into a war room, not a father called in to explain himself for defending his child. Outside the one-way glass, his son Daniel sat in a waiting area under the watch of a youth officer. The boy leaned forward in his seat, small hands clasped tightly, eyes locked on the window as if willing his strength into the figure behind it. His heart raced, not from fear, but from a strange cocktail of pride and uncertainty. He had never seen his father under scrutiny like this. He had seen him in uniform, on base, saluting superiors. He had seen him carry wounded soldiers in photographs, but never here, never in a room where others would question the very things that made him who he was. Inside, the door opened again. Two detectives stepped in. One was older, with graying temples and a voice that carried weight even when he hadn't yet spoken. The other was younger, more animated, a pad already in hand. "Colonel Kessler," the older detective began, gesturing toward the seat opposite him, "I appreciate your cooperation." Kessler gave a small nod and took his seat with measured calm. "Of course." Across the hall, another door slammed. Malcolm Rhines was led into a second room, already muttering about injustice and pain. He clutched his chest, still feigning discomfort from the briefcase strike, his voice sharp and erratic. His lawyer and brother, Victor, followed close behind, tie loosened, jaw clenched, sweat already forming at his temples. The younger detective placed a tablet on the table in front of Kessler. "Before we begin, sir, we need to confirm. Did you strike the civilian, Mr. Rhines, with your briefcase?" Kessler's expression didn't change. "Yes." The detective raised a brow. "Do you deny that it was physical retaliation?" "No," the colonel said plainly, "but I would not call it retaliation. I would call it protection." The older detective leaned in. "We've reviewed preliminary footage. We're going to need your account of what happened before the strike." Kessler didn't flinch. With a steady tone, he relayed the events. Malcolm's taunts, the hateful spitting on his son's face, the boy's shock, and the sickening smirk that followed. His voice never rose, but every word landed like a drumbeat of truth. Meanwhile, across the hall, Malcolm's story took a different path. "He just lost it," Malcolm cried, gesturing wildly. "I was standing there and bam, he slams me with that thing, out of nowhere." Victor chimed in quickly, trying to frame the colonel's reaction as excessive, invoking terms like abuse of military stature and civilian endangerment. But the video footage told another story. The detectives returned with multiple angles, each capturing Malcolm's behavior in unfiltered clarity. The spit, the insult, the unmistakable malice in his face. When they played the audio aloud, Malcolm's voice blared from the speakers. "Maybe next time, wait your turn." Then came the briefcase strike. Not wild, not furious, but controlled and single, like a warning to a man who had crossed a sacred line. Victor's argument shifted. His rank, his uniform, it influences everyone. No one's willing to speak against him because they're intimidated. The lead detective frowned. "We didn't need opinions." The video speaks louder than speculation. Back in Kessler's room, the tone shifted. The younger detective asked, more curious than accusing, "You knew people were watching. Cameras were on. Why react like that?" Kessler paused, then answered softly, "Because my son needed to know that silence isn't always strength. Sometimes you have to make it known that dignity matters." Behind the glass, Daniel sat forward, catching every word. The youth officer beside him smiled faintly. Victor's voice rose again, more desperate now. "You're setting a precedent, letting people take justice into their own hands if they wear a uniform." "No," the older detective said firmly. "We're setting a precedent that children shouldn't be targets." Reporters had already begun to gather outside the station. The story had leaked, first through social media, then into newsrooms. Clips of the incident were now national headlines. Chirons rolled across TV screens. "Colonel defends son from assault." As the final video ended, showing Malcolm's smirk collapsing into shock the moment the briefcase hit him, the detectives exchanged a glance. The lead officer stood and straightened his file. "We're not filing charges against Colonel Kessler," he declared. "Self-defense." Provoked response. "Case closed," Victor exploded. "You can't be serious. You're letting him walk." "He didn't walk," the detective replied, nodding toward the screen showing Daniel. "He stood." And his son saw him do it. In the hallway, Daniel watched the door open. His father emerged with a calm, composed stride, only the faint tension in his jaw hinting at the toll of the moment. Daniel stood up immediately. "You okay, Dad?" he asked, his voice small. Kessler rested a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "Always." They walked through the corridor together, past reporters with flashing cameras, past officers who gave nods of quiet respect. Malcolm, in cuffs, was led behind them in silence, no longer feigning pain, his pride now the only thing injured. As the doors opened to the outside world, cheers erupted from a small group of waiting passengers who had followed the case since the gate. They clapped and shouted support, voices rising like an anthem. The colonel gave a single nod of acknowledgement, then turned to shield his son from the crowd. Because this wasn't victory. It was only survival. And just beyond the precinct walls, the real war for truth and justice waited to begin. When one front closes, another awaits beyond the door. The courtroom lights felt too bright, sterile and unblinking, like they were trying to burn the truth into the walls. Colonel Adrian Kessler sat quietly at the defense table, his posture straight, his jaw tight. There were no medals on his chest today, no uniform, only a navy blue suit that carried its own authority. Beside him sat Roland Greaves, his attorney, a man whose calm voice could cut through stone, armed with a tablet full of evidence and the kind of quiet precision only years of courtroom war could refine. Across the room, Malcolm Rhines leaned toward his brother Victor, whispering nervously. Victor, sharp-suited and pale, scanned the jury with a rehearsed expression of concern, but sweat glistened on his temple. Victor had thrown his last dice, filing a civil suit claiming public humiliation and bodily harm, framing the colonel as a violent aggressor. It might have worked, had the world not already seen what happened. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, their fingers poised over keyboards. A handful of the passengers from the flight sat in the benches, some looking quietly supportive, others merely curious. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but everyone knew that what happened here would be dissected across every news outlet within the hour. The judge entered. The room rose, then settled again like a held breath. Kessler kept his eyes forward, his hand resting over a folded sheet of paper, his statement. He hadn't planned on saying much, but Roland had insisted he speak. Not to defend himself, but to speak for Daniel. Victor stood first. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice smooth and theatrical, "we are not disputing what happened. We are asking, was it justified?" He paced with deliberate steps, pausing to lock eyes with members of the jury. "My client, Mr. Malcolm Rhines, was assaulted with a weapon, a loaded briefcase, in front of a crowd, with the full force of a military-trained man." Malcolm sniffed loudly for effect, leaning forward slightly to appear fragile. A faint cough slipped from his lips, the same cough that had become infamous. Victor continued, his tone sharpening. "Now, imagine you were in his shoes." Words were exchanged, yes. Tempers flared. But did that justify physical violence? He turned back toward the jury, hoping to plant seeds of uncertainty. We are not trying to smear the colonel's service. We respect his sacrifices, but no one, not even a soldier, should be above the law. Roland didn't rise right away. He simply tapped the play icon on his tablet, and the court clerk mirrored the screen onto the larger display. The video began. Gasps rippled through the room as the now viral footage played. It showed Daniel flinching, the glob of spit hitting his cheek, Malcolm's sneering words, "Maybe next time, wait your turn." The sharp slap of the briefcase came a moment later, controlled, deliberate. Roland finally stood. "You've seen what happened," he said calmly. "Now let's talk about why." He turned to face the jury fully. "Colonel Kessler is a decorated officer, a man who has led teams into war zones and brought every soldier back alive. He's no stranger to confrontation, but also no stranger to restraint." He walked slowly, measured. When that man spat on Colonel Kessler's 12-year-old son, that wasn't a slip. That wasn't an accident. It was an act meant to humiliate, to degrade. And yet the colonel didn't lash out blindly. He didn't retaliate with fists or fury. He struck once, not for vengeance, but to make a message clear. "You will not harm my son again." Victor jumped up. "Objection, editorializing." "Sustained," the judge said, but Roland had already paused. He turned toward Malcolm. "Tell me, Mr. Rhines," he said, "how is it that your injuries are so grievous when hospital records show nothing more than superficial bruising?" Malcolm opened his mouth, but Roland raised the volume again. A second video played. Malcolm, minutes after the incident, laughing while speaking with a passenger, before spotting a security officer and suddenly clutching his chest with exaggerated groans. The jury chuckled. Some laughed outright. The damage was done. Roland returned to the table. "We have witness testimonies, multiple angles of footage, and medical reports. What we do not have is injury. What we do not have is sincerity." The judge turned to Colonel Kessler. "Colonel, would you like to speak before we recess for deliberation?" Kessler rose slowly. He didn't pace. He didn't gesture. He simply stepped forward, unfolded the sheet of paper in his hand, and spoke with quiet strength. "I've spent my life in service to this country. I've made decisions under pressure most will never understand. But that day wasn't about my career. It was about my son." His eyes moved briefly to the gallery, where Daniel sat beside a military friend of the family, watching intently. No child should ever be spat on. No parent should have to wipe that from their child's face. And no man should be forced to remain still while his son is mocked for the dignity of simply standing where he belongs. He folded the paper again. His voice didn't rise, but it filled the room. "I am not here for revenge. I am here because my son deserves to walk in dignity." And the courtroom, for a single breath, held its silence like a verdict already passed. When dignity speaks, even courts must listen. The verdict came swiftly. As to the charges of assault and provocation brought against Colonel Adrian Kessler, the judge declared, voice even but resolute, "This court finds the defendant not guilty." A pause. Then he turned his attention to the plaintiff. "Malcolm Rhines, you are hereby found guilty of assault, disorderly conduct, and incitement of public disruption." A wave of breath passed through the packed courtroom, relief, vindication, justice. Colonel Kessler sat motionless, his shoulders squared and his hands folded in front of him. To his right, Daniel clutched the wooden armrest of the bench, knuckles white, eyes wide. His face had lost the innocence of earlier days. In its place was something deeper, something forged in humiliation, tested by fire and tempered by quiet pride. Across the aisle, Malcolm Rhines stood frozen, mouth agape, disbelief painting his features. His once proud posture now wilted, He shifted on his feet, casting a glance to his brother Victor, who sat beside their legal counsel with a clenched jaw and reddening ears. Victor leaned in and whispered harshly into Malcolm's ear, but the words were lost in the hum of shifting reporters and murmuring observers. Furthermore, the judge continued, adjusting his glasses as he looked down at the paperwork, this court orders financial compensation to be paid to Daniel Kessler for the emotional distress and public humiliation inflicted upon him by the plaintiff. The colonel rose to his feet. His voice, low and deliberate, cut through the courtroom. Your Honor, with respect, the compensation will not be accepted for personal gain. I would like the awarded funds to be redirected to a charitable foundation, one that supports children who face public abuse, bullying, or intimidation. Gasps echoed once more, not in shock, but in admiration. The judge nodded solemnly. So ordered. Let the record reflect this decision. Or, as the gavel fell with a crisp thud, the courtroom stirred to life. Reporters surged toward the aisle, camera lights flaring like sudden lightning. Yet, amid the chaos, Colonel Kessler turned not to the crowd, but to his son. He bent down slightly, one hand resting gently on Daniel's shoulder. Come on, son, he said softly. Let's go home. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy had already taken root. Microphones extended like spears, questions flying from every direction. But the colonel raised one hand, not in protest, but in restraint. His other arm shielded Daniel protectively, a barrier between his son and the overwhelming storm. Colonel Kessler, do you have any words for the public? What do you say to those who claim your actions were too harsh? What about Malcolm's potential appeal? The colonel paused only once, turning his head just slightly toward the reporters. The camera shutters clicked in rapid succession. No child should ever be spat on for who his father is, he said clearly. His tone was not angry, not bitter, but carved from steel. Then he faced forward again and kept walking. A few feet behind, Victor pushed through the crowd with a dark scowl, his arm locked around Malcolm's. Reporters shouted questions at the disgraced brothers, but they offered no answers. Their fall had been swift, their arrogance dismantled not by fists, but by truth and discipline. Neither would be seen in the public eye again, not for a long time. Weeks passed, but the impact of the incident only grew. The story traveled far beyond the courtroom. Footage of the incident and the trial dominated news cycles. Talk shows debated it. Podcasts discussed the moral weight of the colonel's response. Hashtags like #JusticeForDaniel and #StandWithTheColonel trended for days. Even critics who initially questioned the briefcase strike had to concede when the full scope of Malcolm's aggression was shown. The airline, under intense scrutiny, issued a public apology not only to the colonel and his son, but to all passengers who had witnessed the event. They launched a new training initiative emphasizing civility, anti-bullying protocols, and response ethics. Internal policies were rewritten. A new passenger code of conduct was published and distributed nationwide. Daniel noticed the change one morning, weeks later, as he sat beside his father reading the paper. His fingers traced the headline, Airline Implements Passenger Code, Overhaul After Kessler Incident. Beneath it was a photo of him and his father walking out of the courtroom, the colonel's arm across his shoulders. He glanced up. Did we change things, Dad? Colonel Kessler didn't answer immediately. He folded the paper and set it aside. Sometimes change takes a moment. Other times it takes a fight. This time, maybe it took both. Daniel nodded. He didn't need more than that. That night, the colonel finalized the paperwork establishing the new foundation in Daniel's name. Its mission, to provide resources and counseling for children facing abuse in public settings. The first donation came from the redirected compensation, every cent. The second came from an anonymous donor who had witnessed the incident and wanted to ensure the story continued to echo beyond headlines. And though Daniel smiled more now, there were still moments, quiet moments, when he remembered the sting of that day at the gate, the way people had stared, the heat of embarrassment. But those memories were now tempered by the sight of his father standing firm, never flinching, never backing down. In the end, what remained was not fear nor bitterness, but a deep, unshakable pride. He had not been alone, and the world had seen it. When a father stands unshaken, the world learns what respect truly means. He disrespected a child in public. Seconds later, the colonel's briefcase struck like steel. If you stand for dignity, justice, and accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of arrogance, disrespect, and the swift consequences of provoking the wrong person. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire accountability, justice, and empathy in the face of conflict.